Manuchehri, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay and see the presentation mode?
Yep.
Okay, sounds good. So I better shut off my email or that is going to be noisy. Okay, here we go. So I know many people that are online. It's really good to see a high turnout for our Zoom session this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about Metribuzin tolerance in wheat, but I'm actually going to let one of my graduate students, Lane Newland, really handle the bulk of the presentation because he's been spending a year at 4 sites studying this topic. So he knows it better than myself. I guess I should say that I am the small grains weed science extension specialist. I've been here for about 4.5 years. And Lane he hails from Oklahoma. He's from Burlington. He's gonna jump in about 5 or 6 slides and I'll let him take it away. He's 1 year into his master's program, doing a really good job on this work. So I'm looking forward to him sharing his results. All I'm gonna do is introduce why we're doing this work. And if you're familiar with herbicides or weed control, the word metribuzin probably isn't a new active ingredient. And really, this slide is the reason why we're again diving into how metribuzin might play a role in wheat production. This is a timeline of when we have had new herbicide sites of action introduced. So what does that mean? That just means ways that herbicides kill plants. So yes, it really hasn't been until since the 1990s that we've had a brand new site of action. Some of you might be saying, well, we've had new herbicides. And you're right, we have. We typically have new formulations every year. We even have new active ingredients. You might be thinking about one that comes to mind is haloxifin, which is in Culex. That is a new synthetic auxin, but that group that it's in is not brand new. So we have been working with this same set of sites of action for a long time. We also know that we're rapidly developing herbicide resistance in a number of our weed species. And so unfortunately, we kind of have to deal with these options until something new comes, if something ever does. A little bit of background about metribuzin. It's not a new active ingredient. It was developed early in the 70s in Germany. A few years later, it came to the United States as Sencor by Bayer Crop Science. There also was a trade name Lexone by DuPont. What crops were labeled: beans, wheat, corn, vegetables, potatoes, some forages. And as far as what weeds metribuzin controls, it controls broadleafs and grasses. So fairly broad spectrum. And I put a couple of species that, Lane's work was really about tolerance, not weed control, but some of the species that we did see effective control on pre-emergence were bromes, Italian ryegrass, annual bluegrass, mustards, vetch, little barley, and wild oat. So some economically important weeds in Oklahoma wheat. You already saw on that side of action slide that metribuzin's a photosystem 2 inhibitor, which is a group 5 inhibitor. Basically, it disrupts the electron flow at the photosystem 2 complex, and that is why we have plant death for susceptible species. We have some foliar activity, but really we're looking at primarily absorption through the roots, which is why we would want to try and get this product applied and incorporated prior to weed emergence. We are not the first to look at metribuzin. I'm sure there are some of you that have seen presentations on metribuzin. in the past, and probably even in Oklahoma. Greg Justice, who's one of our managers and who for FMC, who lives in Stillwater, so maybe you know him that way. He did some weed science graduate work under Dr. Pieper in the mid-90s, and they showed that when they were using rates of about 9.7 ounces per acre of Metribuzin, they were controlling many of the bromes in Oklahoma 80 to 100%. You will learn when Lane gets into his data that that's a very high rate. The time that we would need to apply that at that rate, we'll probably be looking at dead wheat plants. So we're trying to figure out how we can balance our application timing and also understand wheat variety tolerance. So not all crops have a variety tolerance component when we're considering herbicides, but Metribuzin is one of those herbicides where susceptibility of our crop, our wheat plant in this case, does depend on variety. So if you pull up just a general Metribuzin 75% dry flowable, a Loveland product perhaps is a common generic, you're going to see this list. The following cereal varieties are sensitive to Metribuzin and are not recommended for use. Many of you who are on this call, you know wheat varieties better than me, and you'll probably notice when you glance at this list that these aren't varieties that we plant today. So we don't have any information regarding currently used varieties, but I do think that this is still a herbicide tool that we shouldn't forget about because of its efficacy on many of our economically important weeds. There already is a product that's labeled in winter wheat that has Metribuzin in it. That's Axiom DF, a Bayer product. It's in a premixture with flufenicet, which is a group 15 herbicide. And the target timing for when we apply these herbicides is called delayed pre or early post. So it's very early in the season, typically about 7 to 10 days after planting, right when wheat has just come up. Sometimes we say spike. And we get excellent control of Italian ryegrass when we use products like Axiom. We also get excellent control of Italian ryegrass when we use other group 15 herbicides like Zidua and Anthem Flex. Zidua is a BASF product. Anthem Flex is an FMC product, but both of them contain the active ingredient pyroxasulfone. And that's what's giving us the ryegrass control. Unfortunately, it has a little bit of a narrow spectrum as far as what other weeds it can control. And so that's why we're looking at the addition of Metribuzin with a product like Zidua. And that brings us to Lane's project. So I'm going to go ahead and let Lane take it away. I'll have you unmute yourself, Lane. There you go. And I'm going to mute myself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Manuchehri. So to start off, we decided last fall of 2019, to test 24 different varieties in our greenhouse for Metribuzin tolerance. We tested at a low rate of 2 ounces and a high rate of 4 ounces. The varieties we chose to test are all varieties that are fairly recent varieties here in Oklahoma and commonly planted, except you will notice a couple on this list, TAM 101 and Bonna. Both of these varieties were tested by Dr. Pieper, and he found that TAM 101 was a tolerant and Bonna was susceptible. So we chose to throw those in just kind of as a check. To go over our results, for our low rate, our top 5 varieties were Iba, TAM 101, Gallagher, Bentley, and Showdown. Our top 5 susceptible varieties at the low rate were Fusion, Ruby Lee, Lone Rider, Strad, and NF 101. At our high rate, our 5 tolerant varieties were Uncharted, Bentley, Spirit Rider, an experimental variety here at Oklahoma State, and Skydance. Our top susceptible varieties at the 4-ounce rate, all of these varieties had 100% damage. They were dead plants. They were Chrome, Lone Rider, Baker's Ann, Endurance, another experimental variety here from Oklahoma State, and NF101. So you'll notice a few of these varieties are highlighted. These are varieties that we decided to carry over into our field trial. We decided to use these varieties because we saw some really interesting stuff with them in the greenhouse, some interesting data. We also foresee these varieties as being on a lot of acres in Oklahoma in the near future. And through talking with Dr. Carver and his knowledge of the lineage of these varieties, we decided they would be best for our field trial. This leads me to our objectives. We wanted to evaluate 2 tolerant and 2 susceptible current winter wheat varieties that we screened in our greenhouse to metribuzin and pyroxasulfone. On the bottom left, we have our molecular molecule for metribuzin, and on the bottom right, we have our molecule for pyroxasulfone. In 2020, we had 4 locations, Tacoma, Fort Cobb, Goodwell, and Perkins. 3 of the 4 of these locations had access to irrigation, which was pretty crucial for this project because we need rainfall or irrigation of some sort to incorporate both of these herbicides into the soil profile. Both of these herbicides are pre-emergent herbicides, and they need to be activated by rainfall. For our varieties, as I mentioned, we chose from the greenhouse Fusion, which carries the Oxygen trait, Showdown, which was released from OSU by Dr. Carver, Strad, which carries the Clearfield trait, and Uncharted. Both Strad and Uncharted are very recently released. For our timings, we had 2 different timings, a true pre-emergence, which was sprayed directly after we planted, and an early post-emergence, which was sprayed at wheat spike, which was roughly 10 to 14 days after planting. I will point out, if you look at the label, our true pre-emergence timings, both of those are technically off-label, and our 4-ounce rate at our early post-emergence timing is technically off-label depending on your organic matter percentage. So to our treatments, we had a control non-treated, a low rate of metribuzin at 2 ounces, tank mixed with Zidua, and a high rate of metribuzin of 4 ounces, tank mixed with Zidua. As I mentioned, rainfall is very important for these herbicides. At Fort Cobb, we have rainfall on the left and our date on the bottom. We planted Fort Cobb on the 4th of November in 2019, sprayed it with our pre-emergence, and then about 3 days later, we had a pretty good rain of 35 hundredths. And then for our early post-emergence, we sprayed that on the 22nd of November, and we got a rain that evening. So we had excellent weather for this experiment. We didn't have to use the irrigation. Worked out great. The label calls for 1/2 inch, but in these sandier soils, this was adequate to move our herbicide into the soil profile so that when the weeds germinate, they can uptake the herbicides. At Perkins, we have rainfall again on the left, date on the bottom. Perkins was planted on the 18th of October. We got a rain a couple days later, a little heavier rain of 0.8. We got a rain again in between our planting and our early post emergence, and we applied our early post emergence on the 29th of October. So they were both incorporated, and it worked out. We had really great weather and conditions for this trial. For the results today, we're going to talk about Perkins and Fort Cobb for the sake of time. I did want to mention that Perkins is a sandy loam soil and Fort Cobb is a fine sandy loam. We're going to be looking at visual injury. So for visual injury, I was out in the field approximately every 2 weeks taking visual damage. This was on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the worst damage to the plots. We also have wheat yield that we'll discuss. And yes, go on to the next slide. Right here's a good picture of the Perkins plots overhead with a drone. So before we continue, let's talk a little bit about the Metribuzin label. I think we've already gotten a couple questions about soil texture. So as you'll see here on the bottom is our soil texture moves from fine to coarse. Our herbicide rate moves from high to low. Here in Oklahoma, we're going to be in this 0.75% to 2% organic matter. So for a coarse soil texture, we're 1 to 2 ounces per acre. For a medium, we're 1 to 3 ounces per acre. And for a fine, we're 2 to 3 ounces per acre. So as I mentioned, our 4-ounce early post treatment, it's going to be pretty rare to find a 2% organic matter here in Oklahoma, but if you do have that, then that would be on label. It is very important that you take a soil test to know what your soil texture is and also to know what your pH is. If you have too high of a pH, your Metribuzin is not going to be as effective. If you have too low of a pH, it'll persist in the soil for too long. So now let's get into some results in our graphs. For Fort Cobb at peak injury at both sites occurred between 6 to 8 weeks. But at Fort Cobb, we had a time by rate interaction. We have visual injury percentage on the left and our timing on the bottom. Our 2-ounce rate is in black and our 4-ounce rate is in gray. So what pops out on this graph first is our 4-ounce rate at the pre-timing. It exhibited about 55% damage, which was much higher than the 2-ounce rate or the 4-ounce rate at the early post timing. There was not a significant difference between the pre-emergence timing and the early post timing for the 2-ounce rate. For Perkins at our peak injury, we had a variety by rate interaction. Again, we have visual injury on the left, but this time we have our rate of Metribuzin on the bottom, 2 ounces and 4 ounces. What pops out on this graph when you first look at it is our Fusion and Uncharted at the 4-ounce rate. Both were significantly higher in damage than the other varieties in the 2-ounce rate. When we look at the 2-ounce rate, they didn't differ significantly too much, except for our Strad exhibited the least visual injury at the 2-ounce rate. For Perkins, for a visual injury, we also had a time by rate interaction. Visual injury on the left, timing on the bottom again. You'll notice on this graph, our 4-ounce rate didn't matter for our timing. They were not significantly different, and they both exhibited much more damage than the 2-ounce rate. There was a difference in timing when it came to our 2-ounce rate. So our early post rate at 2-ounce was significantly better in terms of visual injury damage than our pre-emergence at the 2-ounce rate. For Fort Cobb, now we're going to get into some yield data. Yield is on the left, rate is on the bottom. This is a time by rate interaction. So for our 4-ounce rate, our pre-emergence timing, the yield significantly dropped off at about 60 bushel. There was not a significant difference between our 2-ounce rate and our non-treated control. We also had a variety by rate interaction at Perkins. Yield on the left, rate on the bottom. we'll just go across from left to right with our varieties. So first we have Fusion. Fusion was not significantly different between the non-treated and the 2 ounce. However, it did drop off yield at the 4 ounce rate. Showdown was the only variety that did not significantly differ amongst the different treatments. It was pretty level across the board. For Strad numerically had the highest yield for the non-treated. However, it is the only variety that as we go across each treatment, it significantly differed in yield. And then lastly, we have Uncharted. Uncharted, much like Fusion, there was no significant difference between the non-treated and the 2 ounce. However, the 4 ounce did drop off on yield. So in summary, for our percent peak visual injury at Fort Cobb, there's a 30% visual injury following the 2 ounce rate, regardless of timing. And there was a 31% visual injury at the 4 ounce rate at the early post, and a 56% visual injury at the pre-emergence timing. Following up that with Perkins. So at the 2 ounce rate, in the early post, there was 32% injury and 44% injury at the 2 ounce rate for the pre-emergence timing. At the 4 ounce rate, Fusion and Uncharted had the most visual injury, and at the 4 ounce rate, there was about 55% injury observed, regardless of application timing, that being either pre-emergence or early post. On the yield, for Fort Cobb at the 2 ounce rate, there was no yield reduction. For Perkins, Showdown yielded similarly regardless of Metribuzin rate, and Strad only varied where yield was reduced at the 2 ounce rate. So some of the take home and future work before we wrap this up. So we're almost done planning our 2020-2021 field trials. We have one more site to plant. Hopefully we can get to it before the weather comes in this week. Really looking forward to some interesting data off these sites. Maybe we can further what we've already found. We're also going to continue screening for more Metribuzin tolerant varieties in the greenhouse. This picture here on the right is an automated irrigation system that we've recently purchased and set up in the greenhouse. This should help us ensure that each variety and pot receives the same amount of watering. I want to test, I think we have about 65 more varieties to test. So hopefully we'll find out some good information with that. And lastly, we're going to be doing some trials on Metribuzin efficacy, excuse me, on troublesome winter grasses. Hopefully we'll have some fact sheets to get out to you guys.
All right.
And
Thank
with that,
you very
I'll turn it back over to Dr. Manuchehri.
Okay, Brian, I was just going to say a couple things if that's all right. Okay. Thank you, Lane. I'm going to go back and credit Lane on, or I was going to, this irrigation system. It's really difficult to screen for herbicides applied at the pre-emergence timing and keep everything controlled. And I think he's being a little humble that we purchased this watering system, because really he built it. And it's really nice to screen for 4 varieties in the field, but we obviously want information on a lot more than 4. And so I see that Bill asked if tolerance and susceptibility to Metribuzin, if it's routinely noted or advertised in the description. No, but I hope that we will have some information soon. I know that we will when Lane wraps up this work. Again, just 1 year of field work, so we definitely want to see what happens this season, and then we'll continue with the greenhouse work. Someone asked about media used in the greenhouse. So this is field soil. This is the sandy loam from Perkins. Also really important that we are using soils where we typically have the most injury by this herbicide. And those are going to be our sandier soils. And so Lane digs up all this soil and brings it back to the greenhouse. I think I had maybe one more question. I think it was answered, but it was just when Lane was going through the visual injury and whether or not we had an economic impact. And I think that you saw that, yes, even though we were recording up to 30% injury at the 2-ounce rate, really no yield loss here. You could argue that, yes, on one of our non-treateds, we had a little bit of a bump, but I think that's just some plot variability. So that was for Fort Cobb. And then for Perkins, when we're at the 2-ounce rate, for most of our varieties, when we go from 0 to 2 ounces, we did not have a significant reduction in yield with the exception of Strad. But again, that's only one site year. So we're going to be looking for some replication this year and some of those trends to see if that's something that we really need to take note of.
Misha, I got a quick question.
Yes.
When we worked with Axiom with Peeper, when we were first working with it, we did have one location or site year that we had significant injury stand loss, but the yield was better because we had a dry spring because we thinned out the stand. Your injury, was that just chlorosis or is that stand loss, or did you do any tiller counts or head counts?
Yeah, that's really good. So Lane took biomass at 3 different periods. I'm going to unmute you, Lane, so you can tell Josh what exactly those timings were. You took above ground biomass?
Yeah, so to start, we did see a lot of stand loss on a couple varieties. One in particular was Fusion, really in the first 6 to 8 weeks. And then it kind of filled in itself, especially with how great of a year we had, and kind of made up that stand loss with yield. And then as far as biomass, we took one biomass sample in the fall, one biomass sample at green up, and one at harvest right before we harvested the plots. And I think Dane mentioned what was the pH of the trials. Perkins pH was 6, and Fort Cobb, I believe, was 5.5.
And Lane also has partitioned some of the end of season biomass so that we can calculate harvest index. And that's why Dr. Silva and Dr. Carver on his committee, so that we can kind of better understand, Josh, what's going on physiologically. And we're not quite there yet on the results, but we will get there.
Yeah, because I think there's going to be a big component on which varieties are more resilient at lower populations as well.
Yeah, and we are planting these at pounds per acre. So that's another thing to take into consideration.
All right.
Good questions. Thank you.
Good questions. I want to move on though.